We're live.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The voice you're hearing now is me, Rob Manawis. I'm a professor here at FSW, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for our Holocaust Committee. Tonight we'll be joined by a great professor named John Cox. But before we introduce our speaker, I'd just like to let you know that it has been a tropical storm that seems to have passed us, but we may still be experiencing some of the bands of that storm. So there might be some technical problems. If there are, just remember that you can use this YouTube link to view the recording, go back to it, and it will be saved afterwards to share and to view again. So please go ahead, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we will communicate them to our speaker. At the end, we'll do a Q&A. Okay, so it is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, John Cox. I had the pleasure of meeting when he was a professor here at FGCU in Southwest Florida over a decade ago. And he founded the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Judaic Studies, I believe, at FGCU. And he is now the director of the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies at UNC Charlotte, and has been doing some great work on the Holocaust and other genocides throughout history. So, John, please go ahead and introduce yourself. You can begin.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Robbie. And thanks for the invitation. And this is a great two-day program that y'all put together. And I was so delighted to hear from Robbie, who was one of my favorite people when I was at FGCU for 5 years, from I guess 2006 to 2011. And yeah, in fact, Robbie, you should transfer to UNC Charlotte. I need more students like you. All right. And I miss all my good friends down there. There's a lot of great things happening in y'all's part of Florida. And but I'm going to try to be fairly concise tonight. So I'll just get right to my talk. But I definitely want to express my gratitude and thanks to y'all for putting this program together. It's so important that we take time. I think, to me, maybe the anniversary of Kristallnacht is maybe even a more powerful and important date than some other dates on which we have Holocaust Remembrance Days, because Kristallnacht, the long night of terrible violence throughout Germany and Austria, 82 years ago, it heralded the turn toward an openly violent policy. It also just revealed a lot of things about the success that the Nazis had in the previous 5.5 years in turning many average Germans, non-Jewish Germans, against their German neighbors. And so, yeah, to me, it's an exceptionally powerful date on the calendar. Well, and I'll say a few more words too about what Kristallnacht revealed about the indifference of the world and about a number of other things that are still very much with us today. So we've all been using Zoom a lot. I still have to think for a second as I figure out how to share a PowerPoint. Okay, so anyway, this is me. I direct our center. Our center at UNC Charlotte also has a long name that's hard to remember, like the center at Florida Gulf Coast University. And I'm a professor of history as well as global studies. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to just speak for about 35 minutes, which isn't easy for professors, because professors, it's like as soon as they hand you your PhD, then you become really long-winded and verbose and even undisciplined sometimes, and you're speechifying. But I'm going to really try to slim things down, because there's more to be said that could be said in a full semester or anyway. So what I'm going to do is just touch on a few things and make some points about how Kristallnacht, which was in many ways kind of the opening salvo, you could say, or in many ways it heralded the impending genocide that would begin over the next couple of years after Germany invaded Poland and then the Soviet Union. But so I'm going to make a few comments about some of the factors that made it possible for this terrible crime to transpire, and then also draw some parallels or some lessons. And I always try to be careful to be humble when using a term like the lessons of the Holocaust, because sometimes that leads people to either being grandiose or pompous or simplistic on the other hand. And but yet there definitely are some things to learn from. Well, there are most definitely some things to learn without having to use equal signs or to say that certain things I'm going to speak about are exactly the same. But the whole point of an enterprise such as comparative studies of history and comparative genocide studies is to find comparisons, contrasts, parallels, similarities, as well as dissimilarities between various episodes in history. So I'll just say, again, this is a pretty stripped down list of factors that made the Holocaust possible and that made the Night of Terrible Violence 82 years ago possible. One thing that I always point out to my students was that the Holocaust was not a uniquely or a purely German phenomenon. In fact, it would actually be kind of comforting in a strange way if we could say that the Holocaust occurred because one country had gone mad or because of this one fanatical zealot leader who somehow inspired people to do his will and so on. But in fact, when you look more closely, then we have to draw conclusions that are much more disturbing about much broader, more universal trends in Western civilization in particular, and especially in European and American civilizations. So at any rate, the Night of Terrible Violence definitely, most obviously was an expression of the fiercest forms of anti-Semitism. There was a powerful book written by a guy named Alan Steinweiss a couple years ago, as well as another book by a gentleman named Alan Confino, that reminded us that it really went far beyond even the appalling scenes on the of trashing synagogues, stealing property, etc. But it was also a night filled with ritualistic forms of abuse and humiliation. In other words, rituals that were based on many centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. And so again, this is something that was not invented by Hitler or the Nazis. And in fact, it was something that was very strong on this side of the Atlantic, as well as on that side. Other things I think for us to think about in the modern world are the ease with which a profound social and or economic or political crisis can lure many, many people into supporting authoritarian sorts of populists, racists, etc., who were seek to turn people against scapegoats in order to to gain political power. Something that has definitely not disappeared in the world is a very strong and virulent and exclusive and ethnic-based forms of nationalism. And this was certainly a key ingredient in the Kristallnacht pogrom and in the Holocaust, was the conception that Jewish people, including German Jews, were not Germans. In fact, were not Europeans or even, obviously not considered equal members of the human race. But so again, back then and today as well, forms of nationalism existed that lent themselves very easily to mobilizing people for genocidal enterprises. Something else that definitely was in abundance in the aftermath of Kristallnacht and for the next 6.5 or 7 years, actually longer than that, actually, even beyond World War II, was the indifference of the outside world. And the fact is that the Kristallnacht pogrom was widely reported. It was on the front pages of the New York Times, which maybe not every single person reads, but it was widely reported in the American press, in the European press. So it was well known by that point, more than 5.5 years into Adolf Hitler's regime. Not only that Hitler bore a fanatical and violent form of anti-Semitism, but that in fact that this terrible night that included the roundup of more than 25,000 Jewish men, the trashing of many, many hundreds of businesses, synagogues, the murder of at least 100 people at the very least. That was well known. and because of the depths of anti-Semitism, nationalism, xenophobia that had been exacerbated by the economic crisis of the 1930s, then whether in the United States or in various parts of Europe and elsewhere, there was very little expression of sympathy. There was certainly sympathy among many common people, but the governments of those countries, the so-called international community, continued to keep the door slammed in the faces of European Jews who were attempting to flee from the terror of Hitler. And so we were speaking beforehand, Robbie and I, about a common acquaintance, a fellow named Adam Jones, who's a very important genocide scholar. And I wrote a book about 3 or 4 years ago on genocide in the 20th century, which I think is a good book. Adam wrote really the best book on genocide studies, but his book is gigantic, so it's a lot harder to carry around in your backpack than my book. But Adam is also a photojournalist, and this is a photo that he took in Rwanda. So there's a bitter irony in this photograph. After the Holocaust, the term "never again" was often uttered, or "nie wieder" in German. And oftentimes on our Holocaust Remembrance Days in January and April, and also around the anniversary of Kristallnacht, we will get together and solemnly intone, "Never again will we allow this to happen," while in fact we do continue to allow all sorts of terrible things to happen. Sometimes I wait till the end of a presentation of this sort to bust out this quote from Rabbi Hillel from 2,000 years ago. But I'll say it now and later, because the things that we're talking about, the things I'm going to concentrate on for the next 25 minutes or so, are issues of xenophobia and racism, and that is which were key ingredients in Nazi genocide. And still today, 75 years after World War II, and many hundreds of years after we as a human race should have come to recognize ourselves consistently as brothers and sisters, etc., then still it's far too easy for certain types of governments and political movements to turn people against their brothers and sisters. And so at any rate, this is a concept that I'll return to later. Now, I know that probably most of you, I'm not sure who all is participating in our event this evening. Many of you, I'm sure, know something about Kristallnacht. But it's really important to understand that, among other things, Kristallnacht was the product of Nazi xenophobia, and that is of its efforts to turn Jewish people, German Jews, which, by the way, Jews had been living in German-speaking lands for 16 centuries. And believe it or not, in the last 100 years before Hitler came to power, Germany was considered a relatively safe haven, a country with many more opportunities, a country that was less marred by social and legal anti-Jewish prejudices than neighboring countries, such as France and Poland and others. And so, but at any rate, part of the Nazi plan, in fact, it was part of their founding document in 1920, was to strip German Jews of their citizenship. And there were about a little more than 500,000 Jews living in Germany, who almost all of whom really felt themselves fully German in the year 1933. They'd been there for generations. They thought, spoke in German. Some of the great works of art and philosophy, from people like from Heinrich Heine to Moses Mendelssohn and many others, was actually written in the German language. But at any rate, this was part of the quest of the Germans of the Nazis, that is, was to convince non-Jewish Germans that the Jews were outsiders, infiltrators. They were part of the international communist conspiracy hatched from Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, this is a common factor in virtually all modern genocides, is to have propaganda that links the victim group to some outside force and that asserts that they are not native or indigenous to your country. And that instead they come as invaders infiltrators, and so on. So at any rate, it was actually a horrendous act of kicking 12,000 Jews into basically a no man's land on the border of Germany and Poland, and in a world that was indifferent, that did not have any open doors for refugees. This was the atrocity that then provoked Herschel Grienspan to walk into the German embassy in Paris, assassinate a German official, which then was seized upon by Goebbels and Hitler as a pretext for the night of violence. So I'm going to throw out a few other ideas, not in a completely, well, no, in a pretty systematic way. But I'm just going to basically put out some ideas that I hope that we can talk about. And so, and some ideas that again remind us that we as a so-called international community, or we as maybe citizens of the United States, or we as citizens of the world, that we really haven't learned as much collectively as we should have in the last 75 or 82 years. And so, for example, a key ingredient in the fact that the United States, as well as countries, relatively wealthy countries, despite the economic slump of the 30s, relatively wealthy countries continued to slam their door in the faces of desperate Jews fleeing the terror of Nazism in Germany and Austria, was not only the persistence of anti-Semitism that was built on hundreds of years of myths and stereotypes and whatnot, as well as theology, but that had been exacerbated and really intensified by racism, by racist beliefs that had flourished over the previous century, and that had Europeans and Americans believing that the Jews were a race. And then combined with that, as if that's not lethal enough, was extreme xenophobia that again was intensified by the economic crisis of the 1930s. And this is again something that we can't take much solace today in the United States in recent years in saying, well, we've learned something about the deadly logic of xenophobia and so on, because it didn't take much for xenophobia to become sharply intensified in recent years in this country. So at any rate, for example, in the summer of 1939, 6 months after the Kristallnacht pogrom, it was the infamous saga of the ship, the St. Louis, that carried, I think, 937 Jewish refugees trying to flee Europe at a time also when the World War II was on the horizon, and it was known that Germany would extend its empire beyond what it already had, which was Germany, Austria, and part of Czechoslovakia. These people fled. The FDR administration refused to allow them to disembark in Florida, as a couple other governments, including in Cuba, also prevented them from disembarking. The ship went back to Europe, and several hundred of these folks later perished in later years during World War II and the Holocaust. Now, believe it or not, as absurd as this might sound to us today, there were many politicians, newspapers, and others in the United States in 1939 who were saying that these desperate people trying to flee Europe were fifth columnists. That was a term of recent origin that came from the Spanish Civil War at that time. But in other words, the idea that they were secret agents, because many of them were German or Austrian Jews. Oh, they could very well be agents of Hitler. Absurd as that sounds, though, that's not that different at all from things that we heard in recent years about, for example, well, people fleeing Syria could be agents of ISIS, when in fact, people fleeing Syria in the last 9 years were squeezed between a murderous regime and a murderous group called ISIS, among other things. And but yet again, the most outlandish sort of xenophobic nonsense was widely accepted here in this country in recent years, and was accepted also here in this country in the United States in the late 1930s. About close to 4 years ago. It was actually the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th. That's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, when the Soviet army arrived at Auschwitz in 1945. And it just happened to be on that very date that the US administration, a new president had just been inaugurated 1 week earlier. And it was on that date, January 27th of 2017, that the Trump administration announced its infamous ban on refugees and other migrants from majority Muslim countries, as well as some other countries, an explicitly xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic ban. So on that very date, within very few hours, someone on Twitter started this feed called the St. Louis Manifest. So you can look that up if you wish to. I thought it was a very brilliant and powerful idea to illustrate, again, these extremely uncomfortable and disturbing parallels between xenophobia today. And also, by the way, there are a lot of relationships actually between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But at any rate, so what this person did was to find the stories of Jewish folks who had been on that ship and who later perished during the Holocaust. And again, one would have thought that America as a society and or the world would have learned something from earlier years, but that has not been the case. Let me just say too that among the really rather absurd and pernicious fictions that keeps many Americans and many Europeans and people in other parts of the world wound up and vigilant and fearful and fretful about immigrants is the very strange and bizarre notion that people just get up and leave their village where their families live for generations just for the hell of it, just because they want to break an American law or something. In fact, people flee because they feel they have no choice, and because their options are extremely limited, and because it is extremely difficult and time-consuming and expensive, extremely time-consuming and extremely expensive to to wait in line, so to speak, for 10 or 15 years, and then you may be turned away anyway. So anyway, this is a powerful poem that I like to quote sometimes from a poet from Somalia who ended up in London. I'll just say too, I like some of these images that came out shortly after the US administration announced its travel ban and refugee ban against from people from certain majority Muslim countries in January 2017. These were some actually really uplifting and hardening types of images. Members of Jewish communities around the United States taking a stand in defense of these migrants and refugees, and understanding the terrible history that was being resurrected in some sense during this time. I'll just say too, in connection with this, that many of the outlandish and I shouldn't say outlandish, well, they are, but I'll say instead lethal forms and expressions of racism and xenophobia that are still very much with us are really oftentimes repackagings of ideas that have been around for a very long time in this country. And there are many other countries that share these dreadful histories and continuities of racism and xenophobia. So papist, of course, refers to people from Catholic countries such as Italy and Ireland. Chinese immigrants will destroy our economy. They refuse to assimilate. And believe me, in the 1920s and 1930s and before and after, you didn't have to go too far. You didn't have to, it wasn't just the most extreme racist and anti-Semites like the Ku Klux Klan, which was very much on the rise in the 1920s, but all sorts of politicians. In fact, in the 1930s, in part because of the economic crisis, certain figures such as Charles Lindbergh and others with the America First movement and some other movements like that, definitely, ratcheted up this idea that the Jews were outsiders. They were both the architects of the communist threat, as well as but then simultaneously, they were the capitalist exploiters and financiers and bankers who were doing okay during the Depression and so on. And these ideas, frankly, are no more appalling and as well as absurd than ideas that we hear often voiced in our own world. Another thing I'd like to touch on a little bit in my fairly brief presentation, and this is another topic that could be the subject of a full college semester class, is about the convergence of racism and anti-Semitism, especially in the late 1800s. So race itself is something that people, namely white people to be more precise, conjured up from the 1400s and 1500s onward. And then they really got carried away with themselves through the 1700s and especially the 1800s, carving up the human race into many, many dozens and dozens of so-called races. And so at the very time throughout the 1800s, when things like the Enlightenment and some other trends that had kind of a secularizing influence and even a democratizing influence in Europe and in the United States, at the same time, those things were coming along, giving some hope to Jews that they were being, they were beginning to be able to break free of centuries-old restrictions on where they could live and work, and also some centuries-old stereotypes and myths were losing their force as religious ideology lost its force to some degree during that time. But right at that time, these new ideologies of race and racism came along and really reinvigorated anti-Semitism and turned Jews into a race. And I'm saying that in quotation marks, in the view of many, many Europeans and Americans, and I mean also educated elites and so on. It's not easy to see this, which is maybe just as well because it's quite appalling, but it's an example of what you could call the racialization of Jewish people at this time, depicting European Jews with all sorts of exaggerated features, large noses and everything else like this. And so again, by this time, by the late 1800s, it became quite commonplace to begin to refer to Jews as the Jewish race. And so there are a number of things that we think of as Nazi terms, like the term Aryan, or terms like Nazi race, or even the term Lebensraum, or the concept of living space, of conquering spaces to settle yourselves and so on at the expense of the people you're kicking off. Those were actually all concepts and even terms that existed on both sides of the Atlantic. And in fact, they were, in some cases, even stronger in the United States than in much of Europe in the late 1800s, also related to this eugenic ideas and things like that. So this is just another example of an appalling racist cartoon in a mainstream publication around the turn of the century. About 3 years ago now, a little more than 3 years ago, was it was really an entire weekend of Nazi and Klan and fascist violent rampages in the streets and parks and elsewhere of Charlottesville, Virginia, and which startled a lot of people, shocked a lot of people. In fact, to many of us, it was horrifying, but not so shocking. In fact, I come from a city, Greensboro, North Carolina, where Klansmen and Nazis shot 5 people dead, 5 anti-racist protesters in November 1979, and then and it was captured on video. And these Klansmen and Nazis were never convicted of a crime. And in fact, as actually one of the people who helped organize that massacre in 1979 later went into a Jewish retirement home just about 4 or 5 years ago in Kansas City, shot up the place and killed 3 people. And so then and now, many people, especially on the far right, 80 years ago was more widespread, 100 years ago among the general populace, firmly held this idea that Jewish people are not even white, that they're members of a separate race, that they're tied both to communism, to outside alien forces. So again, I'm just touching on that to say too that when we do reflect upon the anniversaries such as this anniversary, when we learn and study about the Holocaust and other horrible atrocities in world history, I really believe that we need to look at the universal aspects, that is the disturbing aspects that remind us that the Holocaust itself was not uniquely or purely German, but that Nazism itself was really a creation of really all of Western civilization. And also, again, that racism was a key feature. Sometimes we tend to separate anti-Semitism from racism, but in the ideologies and in the imaginations of these people, again, they had turned Jews into a so-called race, and also their racism against other groups is completely intertwined with their racialized form of anti-Semitism. This is just something, I just put this up to say that I'm about to go to a different slide, but if you Google up EJI, that's the Equal Justice Initiative, a wonderful organization out of Montgomery, Alabama, led by a gentleman named Brian Stevenson, who deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, I often offer extra credit to my students if they can sneak into the house of Aung San Suu Kyi or Henry Kissinger and steal the Nobel Peace Prize off their mantelpiece, whatever, and give it to Brian Stevenson. I'll give them extra credit. Is this being recorded? I guess it is. Okay. All right. You might want to cut that. All right. It's hard to make jokes when maybe jokes aren't appropriate anyway, but it's hard to make jokes when you can't see anyone or hear anyone. Anyway, if you Google up EJI calendar, racial injustice, you'll see this calendar that shows how on every day of the calendar, in fact, oftentimes they had to pick between various appalling episodes. And today, and this is just a reminder too, again, that the main, I'd say, ideological ingredients or factors that led to the Holocaust, fearsome, violent, murderous anti-Semitism combined with murderous forms of racism, again, were things that were quite abundant on both sides of the Atlantic. And today, as well as being about 24 hours into the anniversary of Kristallnacht, today is also the anniversary of an atrocity that happened 40 years earlier in my home state of North Carolina. But you can grow up here in North Carolina like I did and never learn anything about it. And that was a day in 1898 when white mobs, and actually very much like Kristallnacht, it was mob violence in the classic sense of a pogrom. It was this popularized element to it of common people who are not part of the regime, who happily and gleefully took part in the violence and also in the looting and pillaging and so on. But then it also was highly organized, as was Kristallnacht. And in fact, this pogrom, and this was also the only successful coup d'etat in American history, overthrowing a progressive government that brought together poor white folks with black folks. It also, at any rate, it was led by many people, by a future governor, by many other people who, in fact, we still have buildings and streets and statues named after the architects and participants in this coup. And so again, I hasten to add that I'm not drawing equal signs in some of the things that I'm saying. I'm just saying that if we are inhabitants or citizens of the United States, then we should challenge ourselves on occasions like today to not simply wring our hands and say never again, but to look more closely, not only in the complicity of our own country and in all of Western civilization in the Holocaust, but also in the many ways in which we continue to allow horrifying forms of violence, prejudice, bigotry, many of which even have genocidal potentials, and yet we allow them to flourish in our midst. Let me say just a couple other words, and then we'll take some questions and so on. I'm just going to very briefly highlight two cases of really what I consider to be genocides that are unfolding today. Again, 75 years after World War II, and in an era when we like to say never again, and so on. One of them, they both happen to be of predominantly Muslim peoples. One of them is in the Western Chinese province of Xinjiang, and people called the Uyghurs, who have been oppressed for many years, also victims of something you could call settler colonialism, that is of the dominant Chinese ethnicity moving in, displacing in a way that's systematic and so on, indigenous Uyghur peoples, but then also fearsome roundups and other forms of mass violence that have really harshly accelerated in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's estimated that probably at least 10 to 15% of the entire population of Uyghur peoples have actually been rounded up and locked up. Others actually, believe it or not, have police agents literally stationed in their homes, watching them and surveilling them. And much of this, by the way, is justified in ways with the sort of hysteria that many Americans have allowed themselves to succumb to. That is the idea that, oh, these people are Muslim extremists who are somehow tied to ISIS or Al Qaeda, and so we must re-educate them and surveil them, crack down on them, et cetera, all nonsense. But again, feeding on bigotries, fears, and prejudices that have been manipulated by many other governments around the world, also including government of Myanmar or Burma, where in the western state of Rakhine, a large group exists there called the Rohingya people, who are predominantly a Muslim people. And this is, again, it happens to be a government that's ruled by a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi, a government where really the military is still exerts tremendous power, and it was a country that was a military dictatorship for many years, and where these people, like the Uyghurs, have been oppressed in varying ways for many years. Actually, an oppression that really has its origins in British colonialism some decades ago. But there too, especially in the last 3 years, a genocidal pogrom has been conducted against the Rohingya. And I'll just mention too, because again, I'm touching on a number of things that we could, any of which we could talk about at length. But I'll just say that one of the highly distressing and disturbing things about this, especially when we pretend that we've all learned something from the Holocaust, is that again, there's great indifference from the world. Even when communication is much better, the plight of these people is much better known than the world knew of the plight of Jewish people in the late 1930s and even in World War II. And yet, again, they've largely been made stateless. They also, while many of them are fleeing into Bangladesh, they are treated with extreme contempt and disdain by the Bangladeshi government. So, and then I'll also say, before I conclude with a couple other remarks, that here in the United States, we can again take very little solace in any kind of idea that we have learned from our understanding of Nazi terror and of Nazi xenophobia and racism, that has made us as a society vigilant against these evils, because it definitely hasn't. Many individuals, there are many beautiful, humane individuals, obviously, in this country, and organizations just as everywhere else in the world. But yet we have not been strong enough to prevent terrible practices and crimes from being carried out in our name and with our tax dollars and so on. And these are just some horrifying headlines that remind us of the really brutal, barbaric, inhumane conditions that so many migrants are facing. People fleeing, by the way, they happen to, most of these people happen to be fleeing 3 countries in Central America: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where they are actually fleeing conditions that are the results of US foreign policy, US support for dictatorships, the US organization of a terrorist army in southern Honduras in the 80s, and other conditions that led to massive destabilization, introducing massive violence. And then often it's actually the remnants of death squads, military dictatorships, and terrorist armies that the US organized and trained in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s are often a key part of the criminal gangs that have made life miserable for people in large parts of those countries. Okay, so I'm going to just, I always promise I'm going to speak for 35 minutes, then I end up speaking for 40. I'm just going to say one or two more words because after everything I just said, many people might despair. I hope you might want to reach for a beer or something after hearing this professor from North Carolina speak about all these terrible things for the last half hour. But sometimes people ask me, Dr. J, how can you keep going when you teach and read about this stuff and write about this stuff all the time? And I would say that I am able to maintain my hope in the human race, not out of any kind of false optimism or anything like that, but because also my study of history and my participation in political activist endeavors throughout my adult life have taught me and remind me every day that that again that there's that human beings, while they can do terrible things, they often they can and do carry out many beautiful acts of solidarity, resistance, self-assertion, creativity, and so on, that definitely give us hope. Sometimes some of these people become well known, like these four young men in my hometown of Greensboro. They were all first-year students at A&T, and they were fed up with not being able to be served at the Woolworth, the counter, the lunch counter, not being able to get a cup of coffee. They stayed up all night, one night on January 31st, February 1st, talking about, man, what are we going to do about this? This is too much. And they really just decided really spontaneously, these were not guys like longtime activists. Rosa Parks, for example, had actually been an activist for 15 years before she sat down on that bus in 1955. These guys were all 18 years old. One of them was 19, I think. One of them was 17. They stayed up all night talking, decided to go down there. And what they didn't know was that they were going to spark a regional movement that reinvigorated the civil rights movement and that inspired many millions of people throughout this country with the dignity and beauty and power and justness of the cause, and also with the ugliness of Jim Crow racism and of racism, period. This is a photograph of the guys. Actually, it's the son of one of them a few years later in front of a statue. So I say that just to say that also during those sit-ins, there were many people whose names and faces, we'll never see or know, but who were also part of that. These four guys kind of became semi-famous, but they didn't set out to. But many, many other people contribute to struggles in small and large ways and help to whittle away at oppressive systems, help to remind other people of the possibilities of solidarity and so on. I often like to conclude some of my talks with this quote from a writer from Uruguay, who I really loved. He passed away about 5 years ago, named Eduardo Galeano, because I really love his writings because he captures in powerful, indignant terms the injustices of the world, and he unmasks the hypocrisies of the rulers, of the powerful of the world. But then he also finds small ways as well as large ways in which human beings have created, have imagined new futures and worked toward new futures, and again in ways both small and large. So, okay, I'm gonna stop. I don't know if I stopped it or not. Okay, all right, I'm gonna stop the share. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Hey, thanks, John. We have a couple of questions for you. Some of them are from one of our most active participants this week. Their name is Ashrith Reddy. And the first question they have for you is, how did human rights improve from 1938 to now?
Oh, that's a tough one. Okay. Well, they actually did improve. But I'd say, you could say at the organizational, institutional, international level, some of the world powers did learn something after 1945 that maybe it wasn't a good idea to destroy half of Europe, for the second time in 30 years. And so there was a commitment, although sometimes with a lot of hypocrisy involved in it, but there was a commitment of the victorious powers after World War II to set up institutions such as the UN. And then in the year 1948, actually on consecutive days in December 1948, is when the UN Genocide Convention was passed, and then also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. There are a lot of things when you look at those documents, it makes you want to cry a little bit because of all the beautiful ideas that haven't yet really been realized or put into practice. But I would say that there has been progress on the international level, even at the kind of looking at it at an elite level, in some things like war crimes trials, some serious prosecutions of human rights abuses. But then again, I must say that that is completely interwoven with extreme hypocrisy because the top powers in the world can literally get away with anything without any fear of any repercussions of ever having any of their officials, uh, pulled into an international court. So I think that, as with most other things in the world and most other things in our own country, that human rights have improved because of the activism and of ordinary people, so to speak. That is, not of world leaders, not of Aung San Suu Kyi when she won a Nobel Prize, or others like that. But for example, when I was in college, that quote that I just used from Galliano, sometimes when I see that, it reminds me that when I was in college in the 1980s, I must admit that I was part of the anti-apartheid movement, and that was a global movement in solidarity with the freedom struggle in South Africa, where a racist white minority regime had been in power for many decades. And so, but we had a powerful movement around the world, which I think eventually definitely contributed to bringing down that regime. Even though in 1985, when I helped start a group at Appalachian State University, we didn't really foresee that that regime would ever crumble, that Nelson Mandela would get out of prison, much less be elected president or anything of that sort. In this country, too, since 1945, we still live in a time of horrifying and violent and institutionalized forms of anti-Black racism, as well as other forms of racism in this country. And I know some people who seem to think we were living in a post-racial society somehow or another until, and they should have known better anyway, but that horrifying video of the public lynching of George Floyd rattled a number of folks out of any complacency that they had about the virulence, violence, and pervasiveness of racism in this country. Yet the fact is that the civil rights movement in this country did make important gains. Some of those gains in the legal realm have been undermined and chipped away at, but in the social realm of social attitudes, I would have to say that we're a hell of a lot better off in this country today, even as deep as racism still exists. The fact is that because of the power and beauty and dignity of the civil rights movement, it had the effect of bringing about a change in social attitudes among many white folks and others. So I also think, I'm in favor of completely free and unhindered immigration for humanitarian reasons as a human being, because I am a citizen of the world and not a patriot of the country where I happen to have been born. Yet, but I will also say that another reason I really like immigration is that when people get to know other people, it's a lot harder to hold on to prejudices and bigotries and so on. So I'm delighted to see in some cities where I've lived in recent years, such as Charlotte in recent years, as the city becomes more international and more diverse, that definitely has the effect of breaking down barriers and prejudices. And I don't want to go too far overboard with all that. I find it disturbing that 71 million people would vote for someone, would have to overlook some fairly extreme racism and xenophobia to vote for a certain someone. But yet, on the other hand, I see a lot of signs of progress. Progress isn't necessarily eternal, though. That was one of the things that the Holocaust taught us. There was a strong belief through the 1800s and the age after the Enlightenment that human history always moved forward. I think overall it moves forward, but sometimes it can take a big step backward, which is another thing to keep in mind, I guess.
Okay, a couple more questions coming, and we have about 10 minutes left. So Ashrith also asks, I do want to point out too that it doesn't surprise me that you were an anti-apartheid activist. You were always very supportive of student activism when you were at FGCU. It meant a lot to me when I was a student, and my friend Angela and others, of course, So thank you for that and keep up the great work. Ashrith asks, can Warsan Shire be explained more? You mentioned the British poet. Can you of Somali descent? Can you talk about her a little bit more?
Oh man, I could, but then I would expose myself as not knowing what I'm talking about. So I'll just say,
actually,
yeah, I know something about her, but then I'd have to refresh my memory. So I just say if you Google up Warsan Shire, you can read.
Great. I actually did just that when the question was posted and found that she has a band camp and a poetry foundation. And so I'm sharing the link with everyone now. You can go check out her poetry. And here, there's also a New Yorker interview and article about her. But thank you for telling us about Warsan Shire. Okay, and then Ashrith also asked, can you, wait, where is it? Oh, what other ethnic groups face racism? I think you already touched on that when you highlighted the situation with the Uyghurs in China and the Rohingya in Myanmar. Of course, the people in immigration detention and child separation here in the US. So I think we can move on from that unless you want to add to that.
I'll just say quickly another thing. I mean, unfortunately, if I had a globe here that I could spin, I could put my finger almost anywhere, and there's a good chance that something pretty horrifying has taken place. But also in the last year, the right-wing nationalist government of Modi in India has really turned up the intensity on a campaign against Muslims of India, and there happen to be about 200 million Muslims in India. And so through a couple of laws that he's, a registration law and another law. So I would just say, yeah, you could Google up, and find a really powerful article written by Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy is a really wonderful, beautiful person who also, yeah, Robbie, you would appreciate her if you don't know her, because she also brings together, literature, art, and political activism and humanity and compassion all in her work. And she wrote a very powerful article in The Nation, the weekly, publication called The Nation, about 7 or 8 months ago, about also the genocidal potential for Prime Minister Modi's campaign against Muslim populations in India.
Thank you. Yes, Arundhati Roy is one of my favorite writers and activists, and yeah, she's been highlighting the situation in India, especially in the region of Kashmir.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. So next we have Ale. Ale is asking, you mentioned how Jews were accused of being part of an outsider communist regime in Germany. Can you give other examples of how fear of immigrant/refugee groups' political ideology is used to justify violence against them?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, yeah, for one thing too, I'll just kind of, yeah, to even clarify that, because that's something that should be known more widely among anyone who learns anything about the Nazi Holocaust and about German Nazism. You should learn that Hitler and the Nazis, that their anti-Semitism was completely wrapped up with anti-communism and with the belief, which is a belief that they simply adopted from other Europeans and Americans from the previous really 30 years, but especially since the Russian Revolution 15 years earlier, the idea that the Jews were responsible for communism, which was this terrible menace and threat. And they would point to some pretty thin evidence, such as Karl Marx having some Jewish background. Karl Marx wasn't going to the synagogue very often, I don't think, and that a couple leaders of the German Revolution in 1918, 1919 also had distant relatives who were Jewish. But that's important to understand, because that's something that still exists today. Is in fact, when that someone went into the synagogue in Pittsburgh exactly 2 years and 2 weeks ago and murdered 11 people, and the guy who carried out that massacre was inspired by the idea that the international Jews were controlled the subversive and left-wing movements. They were working to destroy America by encouraging invasions of a caravan of Latino immigrants that included Muslims who were members of ISIS. I'm using a lot of quotation marks, by the way, for people who can't see me around everything I'm saying. And in fact, that was at a very time when the Trump administration and others, just was right before midterm elections, had really, really turned up the volume on a hysterical propaganda campaign about a group of desperate and bedraggled migrants from Central America that was making its way toward the American border. And Trump himself was saying things like that they included members of ISIS and all this kind of stuff. And so, but also the guy who carried out that massacre believed that George Soros is a wealthy fellow who is Jewish, but like many Jewish people, that's not the only part of his identity or the beginning or end of his identity. But anytime you hear someone start to rant and rave about George Soros, then you are actually listening to a Nazi-like form of anti-Semitism. The belief that the Jews are both the wealthy financiers who control the economy and the media and so on, and then at the same time they fund and inspire and organize, subversive, anti-American, et cetera, sorts of movements. But yeah, so I'll just say quickly though that also I think in almost any other case of genocide in modern times, you will find that the propaganda of the regime, whether it was during the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, Cambodian genocide, Bosnian genocide, and others, that they would link their internal target to some external threat and depict that their target as not being native to the region, as having come at some point in history as invaders and outsiders. So also just language of invasions and things like that. When you hear people get worked up about immigration into this country and begin to use words like flood and invasions and things like this, that's very dangerous language and very, potentially lethal, forms of, of terminology and of propaganda. This idea of human beings as invaders and so on. By the way, it should also be known that during the terrible crisis that has destroyed Syria for the last 9.5 years, there have been at least 8 million people, more than a third of the Syrian population has fled. Well, the United States has only allowed about 10 or 15,000 of them into the US in that entire time, and none in the last couple of years. Whereas the very small, definitely relatively impoverished countries of Jordan and Lebanon each have more than 1 million Syrian refugees in their countries. Turkey also has more than 1 million. So also, please don't allow yourself to believe anyone who says that the US does too much for immigrants or anything of that sort, because that's very far from the case. And then again, as I pointed out with when refugees are fleeing Central America, and this is also true to a large degree in Syria, they also happen to be fleeing conditions that are largely the product of foreign policies and economic policies of the Western powers over the years. So it is especially appalling and grotesque, and morally shameful to first create the conditions that drive people from their lands and then slam the door in their faces.
Excellent. So we'll end with one last question. I kind of just want to highlight some of your incredible work. You've written a book called To Kill a People, which is geared towards helping college students understand genocide. You've done a lot of your career has focused on teaching us about resistance or researching resistance. And lately you've been doing a lot of research on denial. In the 1 minute we have left, I know that's quite a lot and a very, very broad range of topics, but do you have any final words about any of those things you'd like to leave us with?
Oh man, I'll just say if anyone wants to reach out to me, send me a note. I'll be happy to communicate with anyone. And also, a lot of stuff I publish, I put on a couple websites, because I definitely don't publish anything to make any money, that's for sure. And so I often publish things without my publisher knowing it, on a couple websites. But I just want to give a big shout out to Robbie. Not everyone knows it, but I'm glad Robbie reminded me. Well, I was reminded when you contacted me a couple weeks ago of some great work we did, that I was really proud of working with you and Angela Cisneros and some others back 9, 10, 11 years ago at FGCU. And anyway, y'all are real fortunate to have such a dedicated, compassionate, powerful, and committed and creative person as Robbie Manias in your midst. And Robbie, I took a little look at your MA thesis the other day, and I also just love the idea of using art, literature, and so on, also to educate ourselves, to remind us of our common humanity, but also as pedagogical tools in trying to create a better world.
You're awesome, John. Thank you so much. I've shared the information about your center in the chat, so students can, or whoever's watching can go find out more about the great work you're doing. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe, take care. This link will be archived, so you can come back to it and watch all of the great information that he shared with us today, along with the rest of our other great events that we've had this week. Thank you so much and take care, everyone. Good night.